This is Tell Your Story Alaska. We talk aviation, history, theology, but most of all, the raw stories of Alaskans and the gospel. Hey everyone, thank you for tuning in for another episode of Tell Your Story Alaska. I'm here with my new friend, Hayley, Batt. We are in McGrath, Alaska, and I actually just finished recording another episode of Brad Sturm, and now I'm sitting down with Hayley, and you and Brad work together here at One Wilderness Lodge, and you've become quite the asset. He's been talking about you here at the lodge. So you recently had a severe loss in your life. Yep. Your husband died in August. It's October now as we record this, 2023.
Yeah, it was almost exactly 2.5 months ago.
2.5 months ago. So this loss is still very fresh. And I approached you and asked you if you'd be willing to tell your story about losing a husband.
Yeah.
So before we get to the story of your husband, let's talk about you a little bit. Tell us where you're from and your childhood, just kind of the 30,000-foot view. What is your childhood and where you're from?
Sure. I grew up with my family on the border of Canada and Idaho. On the Idaho side, but some say I sound like I have a Canadian accent. Can't help with that. Yeah, so
yeah,
that
the stereotypical
sneaks in there
A.
occasionally.
Sure.
Yes. My family grew up off the grid. We had a homestead out in the woods, and it was we powered the well pump from a car battery, and we had a little generator that gave us lights at night. But
why did your parents live off grid? Did they have a reason?
My dad always wanted to have a house in the woods that he'd built, and he wanted to kind of be self-sufficient.
Really?
So it's a small house, 1,100 square feet with 5 people in there. So got a little cozy, but it worked. Yeah.
Wow, we've been talking a little bit before, and I did not know that.
Yeah. It's a beautiful view from their living room window. You look up the Priest River Valley. It goes up to Priest Lake, and you can kind of almost see Canada from their living room window. So it was a beautiful view, wonderful childhood, and wonderful parents who love the Lord and were involved in the church. So.
Wow, that's really neat. I did not know that.
Yep.
And are your parents still around?
They are, yeah. And they both are still working. Actually, my dad's an aircraft engineer, and my mom's a music teacher.
Oh, wow.
Yep.
Okay. So let's get into your older childhood. We were talking about a little bit. You had an interest in aviation early on. Yeah.
Like I said, my dad's an aircraft engineer, and so he was involved from even before I can remember in machining parts. He is a machinist and a programmer, so I had things to do with propellers long before I even knew what a propeller was. But then when we moved to Idaho when I was real small, he started working for a company that still builds airplanes, and my dad's still an engineer. And so we were rubbing shoulders with pilots. I mean, every time we had a barbecue or a church event, there was pilots all over the place. So that was...
So you just grew up around aviation, that whole world.
Aviation was a thing all the time, yep.
Okay. Now, before we started recording, you told me about this crazy connection with Quest and the Kodiak airplane and the development of it. Could you just go into some of that, because that was so interesting?
Sure. Yes. If you hadn't heard, there's an aircraft called the Quest Kodiak. It's now the company is owned by Daher, and that's based in Europe. But it started in Idaho, and it was started by a bunch of guys who had a heart for the Lord. And knew something about building airplanes, but they started talking with other missionaries who'd used aircraft for years in places very remote, from Papua New Guinea to South America to the Philippines and Africa, any place you can think of jungles and airplanes. That's where these guys talked to missionaries, and they said, what do you need an airplane to do? And missionaries told them everything from we need to be able to carry this much weight to it needs to be able to land or take off in this short a distance, and it needs to burn this type of fuel. And so these guys that designed airplanes said, okay, we're going to take all these parameters and see what we can come up with. And the Kodiak was born out of that. And it was neat to be a kid and watch this and their excitement and their desire to serve the Lord with their skills in building this aircraft. So my dad was hired by Quest. He was like the third or fourth employee hired ever as a machinist. And so these guys that designed the airplane gave my dad a bunch of drawings and said, can we make an airplane? And so we started machining parts.
Yeah. You know, I come from an engineering family. My father's an engineer. My brother's an engineer.
Okay, there you go.
I love seeing these high-end skills being used for worldwide missions. I mean, how cool is that? People just using what they're good at, and they just nerd out about it.
My dad was actually hired as a welder.
Oh, okay. Oh, wow.
Like, oh, you know how to machine too, huh? Oh, well, okay. We can use that.
And so one of the design parameters was, because historically it's been 206s and Cherokee 6s, you were saying.
Yeah, and 185s and some of that kind of stuff.
And they needed a plane that runs on jet fuel that can do the same thing, basically.
Yeah, and we don't need to get into the parameters too much, but jet fuel and avgas are two different things. It's like car gas versus diesel fuel. You can't put one in the other aircraft generally. And so worldwide, the U.S. is a primary user of what we call avgas, which is leaded fuel. Mm-hmm. You're not going to find that in many of the third world countries overseas that need small aircraft, and so they've been going away from the 206 that burns leaded fuel, and they can bring in jet fuel, which is basically refined kerosene.
Yep.
And most
because that's what the airlines use.
Yeah, airlines use
those
it.
At
ships
the
use it
on
a lot of vehicles. So and kerosene is used even in lanterns. So it's not hard to get kerosene, and if you can find an airplane that burns kerosene, all the better.
Right. Now they don't have to ship the avgas in these 55-gallon drums, which is what they had to do. And insanely expensive.
Insanely expensive and somewhat dangerous, and lots of issues with that. So if they can find something that burns and is readily available, let's do that. So the Kodiak uses jet fuel. It's a turboprop aircraft. PT6 engine is one of the better turboprops out there, I think, in my book. And Brent Whitney knows what they're doing. So
I'd never known the history of the Kodiak. I'm aware of the Kodiak. Someone in my family flies a Kodiak overseas, and so and I have flown in a Kodiak before, so that's new for me. So that's really cool. And you actually ended up working for Quest. Is that right?
Yeah.
And what was that?
Yeah, I got hired when I was in high school. They needed someone to do data entry, and I don't pretend to be a computer expert, but I could punch numbers into a computer, and I was happy to help. And it was neat to just be a part of and see what was going on. I was hired on before they'd gotten type certificate and production certificate, and so I was in some of the research and development side of things, and that's just kind of cool to watch as a kid and be able to see break things on purpose and see us test and bend things to see what kind of parameters we could set in type certificate. So that was neat from my perspective as learning side of things, but then just see everybody's heart for their excitement when it flew the first time. I don't know that there was a single dry eye in the hangar. That was cool.
There is something beautiful when you work so hard on something and then you finally get to see it.
And we've been talking about it. That was everything we always talked about for years. And I remember the first time we even talked about what size, how many seats would be in a Kodiak. It was in the designer's living room at a Christmas party. We had folding chairs, and we moved the couches out of the way and set the folding chairs up. And we're like, this is like what the seating's going to be. And this was probably 5 years before that even flew, but it was so neat to just be a part of that. And the design from the beginning, and to just know the heart behind it was, how can we use our skills to serve the Lord?
Yes.
That was just awesome.
Yes. Yeah. And now that aircraft has been used commercially, and it's become quite popular.
Hundreds and hundreds have been made. I don't know what number they're up to right now, but it's a 10-seat aircraft, and that's comparable in size to like a Cessna Caravan. Yeah. So or a King Air with one engine.
Yes. So cool. So cool. Okay, so you have, from a young child, aviation in your blood. And tell me, from your time with Quest and coming into adulthood, let's pick up your story from there. What happens next?
Sure. So while I was in high school working at Quest as data entry and production assistant, I was it was suggested to me to look into going to Moody. I was kind of bent towards going into the Air Force, and then the designer of the Kodiak's wife sat me down and said, you should maybe consider going to a Bible college instead. And by the way, this Bible college has a flight program that happens to be not too far from here. And so I called up and they gave me a tour. The paint wasn't even dry on the walls yet. Like, this hangar was brand new. And there was some really fancy, shiny 172 airplanes in there. Ooh. And the guy that gave me the tour was the director of maintenance. And you could tell he had a heart and a passion for maintaining the planes well. He had come from a missions background with Mission Aviation Fellowship in Indonesia. I don't remember what base he was in Indonesia, but he had been there for about 10 years and had been maintaining aircraft over there, was excited to plug into the next generation of mission pilots and mechanics. And so his heart for ministry and his heart for seeing what the Lord was doing in these young people's lives was huge.
That kind of bled onto you, huh?
It did. It was somewhat contagious, yes. And I knew that I didn't even apply to any other colleges at that point.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So you had some Air Force ambitions, and after that tour, it was like, I'm sold.
Yep. I don't think I even ever thought about looking back.
Wow.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So you got into Moody then, and you attended there? I
did, yeah. I had sent my application off, and 3 weeks later, I got a acceptance letter, and I graduated at high school and attended Moody within a couple of weeks.
Wow.
Went off to Moody, and that's where I met my husband. We were freshmen in college. We definitely didn't start dating the first year. He was a weird kid. He was a brilliant guy. He was a mechanic, had already come from a year at Bible college, so we didn't have all of our classes together because some of his credits transferred, but his roommate started dating my roommate. Oh. So we ended up hanging out quite a bit.
Yeah. That's funny how that worked out.
That's funny. God has a sense of humor. And we started...
Did his roommate marry your roommate?
Yes.
Oh,
yep.
okay.
And he's a missionary pilot in Congo right now.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yep. We started dating when we were kind of plugged in together as lab partners in A&P school. Since we were hanging out every day, all day long, we thought we might as well get to know each other.
Yeah, right. So is that kind of where the spark started, around that lab time?
Well, sort of. My roommate got us... She loved to do fancy dinners, and I'm doing good if I can remember how to turn the microwave on to heat up the hot dog. I am not a cook, but she says, let's make this, and I don't even know what it was. But then she handed me carrots to cut up. I'm like, I can cut up carrots if I get to eat part of this. She goes, but you have to have someone come over for this fancy dinner because it's couples, and I wasn't dating anyone. And I go, well, who should I invite? She says, well, you should invite Dave's roommate. He likes food. I'm like, that's the only stipulation.
Every guy likes food.
That's sure not. I could go to anybody in the class and get, okay, but this works. So I walked up to Tim. I said, Ashley's doing a fancy dinner. If you want to come, I guess we have to kind of dress fancy, whatever that means. And he showed up in a 3-piece suit.
He was into it.
He was into it. But in my mind, that wasn't a date. That was just me saying, in order to eat food, I have to have somebody here with me.
Do you think in his mind it was a date?
He definitely thought it was a date, because then the following week or 2 weeks later was Valentine's Day. But in my mind, I wasn't dating anybody, so I didn't think I needed to come to school. This was not second grade. I didn't need to come to school with like Valentine's for everybody. But I sit down at my desk in the classroom, and there's a big box of truffles. Chocolate truffles. It said Happy Valentine's Day, Hayley, but it was printed out on computer paper. So I couldn't tell whose handwriting it was. And I'm going, my face turned bright red, like, who on earth? I'm one of 2 girls in a class of 35 people. So everybody else was a guy. So
it could be any one of them.
It could be anybody.
Yeah, like a secret
3
crush.
of them were married, and that was the rest. The rest, I'm like, who on earth is... Okay, this is a little embarrassing. But then I go out to my lab table, and there's a smaller box with the same label on it. I'm like, is this going to go on all day? This is ridiculous. Well, I open the box and it starts blinking. And he was the only avionics technician in class. I'm like, only Tim Batt would wire a chocolate box to blink. And I catch his eye across the and he was grinning ear to ear. And I go, aha! I figured it out.
Is that the first time you realized he liked you?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So then we ended up having lunch together all the time, and the romance blossomed from there. The following year, we were definitely dating. He had to one-up himself because it was only 3 LEDs in that little chocolate box. So the following year, he got a bigger chocolate box, and that thing weighed a ton when he handed it to me. I'm like, what'd you fill this with? Well, I opened it up, and he had 247 LEDs wired and programmed.
That's really stepping up the game.
Yes, it was like reflecting off the ceiling, and all the instructors.
I just love how this kind of love story you're telling is so nerdy, and it's so you and so your husband.
It was so him. Yeah. Well, and we're definitely falling to the nerd category, and all the instructors are like, Tim, you're making the rest of us look bad. And he goes, yep. Like he didn't even care.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we graduated Moody, and we worked both at Moody. I was a maintenance instructor there, and he was in the avionics shop. And he was happiest if he had a soldering pencil and a bundle of wires in his hand. And if you didn't talk to him all day, that was okay too. Yeah. He was really a quiet guy. Yeah. Yeah. But he had a heart for the Lord. He was looking into what it looked like to be going overseas. That was definitely our plan. We knew that where Moody was, that was not where we were going to be spending the rest of our life. Yeah,
and then you were telling me you were kind of originally looking at Africa through some connections you had. Yeah,
Tim had some family serving in Kenya, and so we thought at least even for just a short period of time we could stay with them and kind of get a background on what it looked like to serve over there with someone that Tim knew quite well. And we had even started communications with a couple of different organizations that are in Kenya, with African in the Mission and Samaritan's Purse, and there's a couple others there. And they were all happy to host us. None of them said, no, we don't really want you to come over here. I don't think you'd be a good fit. But we had just started the communication, and Moody hosted yearly a missions conference where they'd bring a bunch of different mission organizations in to say, this is what we do, this is what we're about.
And this is Moody Aviation in Spokane, does
yes,
this?
Okay. Well, and for a while Moody had a campus in Spokane that was aviation, and they also had general studies, biblical studies, they had some pastoral things. I don't remember, 8 or 12 different degrees were offered in Spokane. And so Moody Spokane had a missions conference. And they'd have organizations come from even different countries. We had some out of Canada. We had some come from Mexico and South America, organizations that were from that and recruiting people to go back to them. Yeah. And so we were definitely speaking with the aviation side of things and leaning towards Africa, but that specific conference I wasn't able to attend because I had to work. And so Tim went and went to, I don't remember, 2 or 3 days worth of presentations, and I came home from work. He came home from the conference, and he was quite enthralled with Alaska, and I kept thinking he was maybe misspeaking because all we'd been talking about was going to Africa. But prior to that, I had been quite interested in going to Alaska.
Yeah, could you tell a little bit about your childhood interest in Alaska, that little tidbit of it? We were talking about it before.
Yeah, well, we'll back up a little bit. So my best friend from like birth to about the 2nd grade, and her family moved to Alaska when we were in the 2nd grade because her dad took a job as a pastor. And while I was mad at God, I was excited that my friend got this new job, and I was hearing stories of moose chasing sprinklers in their front yard. And I had this conversation with God that I thought, it'd be kind of cool, God, if we could maybe go to Alaska at some point. It's on my bucket list. And why did you take her away? You didn't ask me.
But were you just a little girl at this time?
I was 7. Yeah, 7 years old. Yep. And I kept in touch with her, pen pals and that kind of thing, but I haven't seen her since because God has since taken her to another location in ministry, and that's kind of cool. But then when I was 12 or 13, the Kodiak, the aircraft we were just talking about, debuted with its brand new paint scheme in Port Ellsworth, Alaska. So the first pictures we see of this fancy new airplane is climbing out over these snow-covered mountains over this beautiful Lake Clark area. And so I remember just the stars in my eyes going, hey, God, do you remember that conversation I had when I was 7? let's just make sure that we move that item on that bucket list up a couple of lines.
Isn't it amazing how, like, in hindsight, these little tiny moments, you saw a picture,
yep,
and you remember that and how pipital it was for you. That one moment. It's
one
amazing.
Little picture, and there may have been 2 or 3 pictures of this airplane, but either way, I'm like, okay, I definitely want to go to Alaska. But one of the things I did was kept it between me and God. Mm-hmm. I may have mentioned it to a friend at church, like, wouldn't that be neat to go to Alaska or something? Mm-hmm. But I never said, like, God, I really need to go to Alaska, or told my husband that I think God's calling us to Alaska. I just kept it between God and myself. So then when Tim came home from this missions conference and he keeps going on and on and on about this Alaska, I'm going, has he been reading my journal, or have I been talking in my sleep, or what's going on? And so finally, at the end of this whole thing of him telling me about these conferences, was he's in his mind, he's trying to figure out how he's going to convince me that we really actually should think about going to Alaska. It took him, felt like forever. Yeah, I really think we should consider possibly thinking about, like, blah, 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 blah. Finally says, I think we should go to Alaska. And then he's expecting me to, like, blow up in his face.
Expecting a pushback.
Yeah, she's going to argue with me. And I said, oh, okay. And so the look on his face was like, how did you know I was going to say that? You do realize I said Alaska, right? And I hear in my mind going, but God, you worked in his heart separately from me, and that is awesome. So we came up here for the first time on a short-term trip in 2013, and we visited 4 different villages, and we're down on the road system a little bit as well. Mm-hmm. And we weren't really sure exactly at that point what village we were going to be in and to what capacity we were going to serve with, but we just knew we were supposed to be in Alaska. Wow. So then we moved up here in 2017, so 4 years later. Yeah. And moved directly from northern Washington to McGrath, with only knowing that our final destination was McGrath. We had to stop in Anchorage because it turns out when you drive the Alcan and you hit a moose in Tok, there's some paperwork you have to fill out.
Which is a whole other story in and of itself, right?
That's a whole other story, but we finally got to McGrath, and the moose didn't make it. Sorry.
He didn't make it.
He didn't make
Hopefully
it.
his meat got eaten.
It did, yes.
Sure.
The trooper, it was quite cold out. It's 35 degrees below zero when we hit the moose. So the moose meat was fine. Yeah. And we've been serving in capacity from aircraft mechanic to substitute teacher, and Tim fixed everything else, including airplanes, from toilets to snow machines and refrigerators, airplanes, plumbing and heating systems for the lodge here. Yeah. All of that was Tim Batt.
Really a handyman, which
he
of course
was.
In the bush is totally necessary.
Very helpful.
You need someone like
exactly.
that. Yeah. Yep. And Tim was that guy.
He was that guy. They jokingly called him the Oracle around here, because even if it's not something that he'd worked on, if it was a system type thing he was familiar with, so if it's not, he'd not worked on your boiler per se, but he knows boilers, he could probably fix it. And without any issues. And he's worked on probably half the village's snow machines and trucks. And
it sounds like he had a very welcome presence in the village. Like, the people were just so glad he was here. Yeah,
they were glad he was here, and his personality was really accepted too. He was just an easygoing guy. He was very soft-spoken, and is such a good listener that he would sit there, and even if he's wrenching on your snow machine for the 12th time, but you want to talk to him, he'd just listen.
There is something so endearing about just a soft-spoken, kind of a quieter guy. They're approachable. They don't have like some big agenda. Right. They're just an endeared person.
And then the other thing is with that is when they do speak, they're speaking with wisdom.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
Yep. So he was a very, very knowledgeable but wise man too. So he was involved in the church here as an elder, and he didn't like filling the pulpit because he really wasn't that upfront and type of person. But when it was necessary, his sermons weren't very long, but they were well thought out, and there was a lot of wisdom to be shared in his
like everything sermons. That he said was important.
Exactly.
Because he thought it through.
Yep.
He's a thinker. Yeah,
he was. And so writing 12-page papers in college wasn't his favorite thing, because he figured he could have everything said that needed to be said in about 4 sentences.
I like that. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah. Okay. Why should I expand on what I needed to say? Because I said it all in 4 sentences.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's go into what are some of the things that I think he started having some health issues. I actually don't know the story. We haven't talked about it yet.
Yeah.
So let's where did that story begin?
Well, he always knew that it was a possibility that he might end up with this disease. And what he got diagnosed with was ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease. Because there was a strong presence of it in his family. There was a long history of genetic ALS, which is very aggressive. So his mom passed away from it, and so did all of her siblings.
Wow. Okay.
And
this
mother,
is something that's genetically passed down.
Genetically
people
passed
are
down,
susceptible to it.
Yeah, they've done like the ancestry type thing, and they know that it's been back to like the 1600s.
Okay.
They don't really know 100% because they didn't really know what genetics were back then, but it's traced back to Europe somewhere.
Okay.
He always knew it was a possibility. It's a 50% chance of getting it. So you can be tested for the gene. That'll either tell you have it or you don't. And even if you have the gene, that doesn't mean that you're going to end up getting it. So we opted for not getting tested because it wouldn't have changed what we were going to do.
Yeah. Okay.
We knew God was calling us to Alaska. And whether or not he had the gene, we were still going to Alaska.
Right.
And that didn't change Tim's ability in fixing snow machines up until the time he got diagnosed.
Yeah.
So we didn't really have a plan in place for if he did get diagnosed. His mom died in 2003, and there was no cure. There was no treatment. So from the time she was diagnosed to the time she passed was 9 months.
Wow.
So it goes very fast.
Yeah.
And when Tim was diagnosed, we thought, well, we at that point prayed for the gift of time, whatever that looked like. If that was time with people to talk, or more time on earth, or whatever that looked like, we let God fill in that blank. We said, God, give us a gift of time, whatever that looks like. So he honored that.
What were some of Tim's reactions when he first learned the news? Like, how did he react to it?
Oh, there was definitely some human reactions of tears and anger. Not at each other, but we were both very upset. There was, what do you do? He was 35 when he got diagnosed. So very young.
Yeah.
And we thought there's so much left that we haven't done. So lots of tears. And then there was a pretty fast acceptance of we knew this was going to happen, or very possible.
Yeah.
So then we were praying for the gift of time, and God honored that with conversations we never would have had with people otherwise. Because they're, I won't say names right now, but we had a gentleman here, it's a very good friend of ours, and he got diagnosed with colon cancer the very same week that Tim was diagnosed with ALS. Now, colon cancer is a scary, scary diagnosis, and can be very serious.
Yeah.
And we knew Tim's diagnosis was going to be fatal. That's what was going to kill him, unless he was killed in a car wreck beforehand. Right. We weren't going to come out of this alive. And so we're sitting across the table from our friend and sipping on chocolate milkshakes or something. And Tim's sitting there he always had this ear-to-ear grin and twinkly eyes. If he would smile, his eyes would almost close shut. He'd get such a big smile. He's sipping on this chocolate milkshake with this diagnosis that he's going to die. And our friend is looking at him, and he's mad. Because while colon cancer is scary, there is treatment for it, and he had a good outcome. But he's looking at that going, how can you sit there with that stupid grin on your face and be so joyful knowing this is going to kill you? Whatever you have, I want it. And it opened up opportunities for us to be able to share heart to heart why we have this weird joy of this world is not our home. Wow. So there's still a lot of anger and resentment, and that individual is still wondering what Tim had and we've little bits and pieces have been able to explain to him. Then he kind of goes, I don't want to deal with God. So I'm like, it's fun from my perspective to watch him and say, God's tugging on those heartstrings and not allowing him to get very much rest until he comes to grips with what this is. So it's kind of cool.
Yeah. it's kind of like that, the harsh reality of death sooner than it should have been.
Yep.
Opened up opportunities that wouldn't have been otherwise.
Absolutely. Yep. And Tim handled it with a lot of grace. ALS is not always a painful disease, and in Tim's case, it wasn't painful, which is great. It's a neurological disorder that allows, like, you can still feel things. He could feel when his feet and hands were hot or cold. He just couldn't move them.
Wow.
So even if, like, his nose itched, he could feel that. He just couldn't do anything about it.
Yeah.
So he would often tell me, can you move my foot, or can you scratch my nose, something like that, where allowed him to get more comfortable. But it didn't hurt. Yeah. Unless he just needed to adjust something in his chair. So that was a huge blessing. But eventually, initially will affect muscles that are voluntary, that you have control over. So your extremities, your eyes, your mouth. But then eventually it'll start to affect muscles that are involuntary, like your diaphragm for breathing. And then it just causes system shutdown.
Yeah.
So Tim was diagnosed in winter or Christmas of 2021. By January, February of 22, we had been given an opportunity to be on an experimental medication that seemed to be quite promising for his specific type of ALS. And it felt like forever to get on it, but it only took about 3 months for all the red tape to go through, which for somebody who only has a 9-month diagnosis to live, we're like, that's a lot of time. But in reality, 3 months isn't that long. So the medication did seem to be working. It slowed the progression down a lot, which, again, God's honoring that gift of time request. He answered that in so many ways. And so from 21 to the end of 22, beginning of 23, there was not a whole lot of progression, which was huge.
Okay.
There were little bits and pieces. At 21, he could still walk, and we started noticing weakness in his legs. Was how we came to this diagnosis. By the middle of 22, he was mostly in a wheelchair, and that was just because he was so unsteady. He got tired of trying to hold himself up. So by 23, beginning of 23, he could still stand on one leg. But he just couldn't steady himself. He lost a lot of movement in his arms, and his right leg was pretty much useless. Wow. So it was more comfortable for him to just stay in a wheelchair. Yeah. But he could still talk. He could still eat. His brain was definitely sharp until the end. So all of that was a huge blessing. Because
did COVID affect any of this during that time?
He got COVID one time, but it didn't seem to. Didn't seem to be any lasting
COVID
effects.
Basically wasn't a factor then.
No, no, I don't think so.
Okay.
We don't. Not that anybody has said officially. So.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think that he even had COVID, other than maybe one time, and it was a very minor case. So that was a huge blessing too. Yeah. It probably helps that we're super rural and there's not a lot of people out here.
You're way out here in McGrath.
Way the heck out here. Yeah. So by spring of 23, we started noticing there was some more weakness coming in. But he got this medication once a month. We would fly in, and since I'm a pilot, we had a plane here. I would fly us in from our village into Anchorage, and we had a wonderful medical team. A good percentage of them were believers. Wow. So that was great. They would pray with us before each procedure. And it wasn't just like a little shot in the arm. He actually was a spinal tap once a month. So let's just go have that fun.
Let's have him stick a needle on my back.
Yeah, but he couldn't see it, so that helped. Yeah. And it slowed things down. It was like every 28 or 29 days we went in for that. Okay. For close to over a year and a half.
So that's like a once-a-month trip to Anchorage in the plane.
Once-a-month trip to Anchorage, yep. Yeah. And thankfully, it wasn't something that we had to be in for a week. He wasn't in the hospital. It was just in the doctor's office, and we got pretty darn good at it towards the end. We had it down to a science.
I bet.
So, Tim could tell the doctor how to do it if he was off a little bit on one side or the other, so he was good at it. But we actually, the week he died, we had just finished 2 weeks of camp, and it was the most successful camp we'd had. We had 37 teenagers the last week from all over the interior. With camp weeks, you're not sleeping a whole lot.
Yeah.
So we had 2 weeks of camp and then a week of conference in Anchorage. And we were kind of looking forward to the conference week being something we didn't have to plan. All we had to do was show up.
Yeah.
And we just had to sit there. And we could snack on food, and we just had to sit there.
I know exactly what you mean. Yes.
So we were kind of looking forward to conference and catching up with a lot of our brothers and sisters in ministry. And we'd been to conference for 3 days. It was a 4-day conference, and the morning of the 4th day, I rolled over to check on him because we were actually in a hotel, and you do this without even thinking about it. When you have a spouse or someone who's medically fragile, you don't even think about it half the time when you're checking on them. You'll look at them, you can tell if their breathing's normal or if their skin color's off or if they look uncomfortable. And so I was like probably 4 o'clock in the morning. I rolled over to use the restroom, and I rolled over and I glanced at him, and I knew something was wrong. But he wasn't in any pain. God had taken him in his sleep. He was not uncomfortable. It looked like he was sleeping, but I could tell he wasn't breathing. And so as an EMT, I work as an EMT here in Alaska, here in McGrath specifically. I drive our ambulance, and I've been to a lot of ugly calls where it takes a while for family or even EMS to realize that the patient has passed. But it took me about 3 seconds looking at him, knowing that he wasn't here anymore. God had called him home. So it wasn't an emergency, but it definitely was something we weren't planning on. At that time, he was not bedridden. He was in a wheelchair, but he could still get around. He was still eating. He was still able to converse, and God called him home.
What are your thoughts on that? Like, it seemed like it happened a little bit early because he was still partly functional.
Yeah, we had just had his new, I think it was God's timing, honestly. So we talked to a couple of different people in medicine on his case, and we're like, this kind of came out of nowhere. There was no indication that it was getting close. And of course the believers on the team said God called him home, and the others were just like, this was just kind of an anomaly. I'm like, no, I think this was definitely planned on God's part. What happened, what the death certificate says, we didn't do an autopsy. But what the death certificate says was that he had stopped breathing. So my suspicion was because the diaphragm was getting weaker. We were noticing that his voice was getting quite weak. That it just decided if he stopped breathing long enough, there's a chain reaction. Your heart needs oxygen, your brain needs oxygen, and your brain and your lungs need blood. So they kind of both have to work at the same time. So if one stops working, the other one's going to stop very soon. So.
Did you say that it was almost a bit of a grace just because...
it absolutely
Like my
was.
grandmother died of ALS, and the slow progression of the body shutting down can cause horrible suffering.
Oh, it's very much so. And I've heard horror stories even in his own family on, like, he watched his mom go through that as a teenager, when he was a teenager, and I wouldn't wish that on your worst enemy.
Yeah.
So I was kind of steeling myself, preparing that he might be going to have to go through the same thing. And it was a huge blessing that God allowed him to not suffer that way. And if he was suffering, he kept it super quiet to himself. And there were times that I know that he was quite frustrated with his inabilities when he couldn't hold on to the fork to feed himself. That's got to be frustrating. And when he lost the ability to be able to, like, shower himself and needed assistance in that. Now I was absolutely happy and willing and ready and able to help him with that. But I know that he lost his own independence. He couldn't drive his snow machine. It was probably the worst one. When he realized he couldn't drive his own snow machine, that was like super heartbreaking for him.
Yeah, so. There's so much attachment for men and their, like, usefulness or ability to use their bodies, their strength, to fulfill their manhood, if you will.
Well, and
to
Tim
lose
was such a patient guy. He didn't really feel like he was not athletic. He didn't feel like he had anything to prove physically. He just liked to be able to drive the snow machine. He picked out that snow machine. It was his favorite. But then his mind never stopped working. The night before he passed, we had just had a long day of conference, and so he was tired. I was tired. It was a long 3 weeks, and so he had laid out a plan that evening. I was going to help him shower the next morning. We were going to sleep in a little bit, shower, go to conference about an hour late, which was fine that day. And then we were looking forward to spending a weekend with his family up in Palmer before we came back to McGrath. So we had just talked about the plan, and he liked to wind down in the evenings by watching like a YouTube video on how to tear apart a tractor engine or something, which bored the daylights out of me. But I was glad that he was enjoying it. He had his headphones in, and he was watching some tractor overhaul video, and was quite happy with himself. And then God called him home in his sleep. Like the tractor video was still playing when I rolled over. It was still on.
Wow.
So there was no indication that he had suffered at all. And that's just the biggest blessing.
Yeah.
Now, the rest of us suffered, yes. So we thought that it was way too early. There were so many questions that he hadn't answered quite yet and explained to us on what engine that needed to be overhauled and that kind of thing. But we feel definitely honored in the gift that God gave us.
Yes.
Yep.
So tell me about the last couple of months. He died August 4th.
Yep.
Today's October 21st. Tell me about how the grieving process has been. What are, what coping mechanisms, or, what's getting you by?
Well, there's a lot of peace knowing that Tim is... I'm jealousy because Tim got to meet Jesus before I did. But a lot of peace knowing he's not in pain, and this world was not our home to begin with. Yes, I miss him. And it comes in waves. I'll be fine, and then a sound or a smell of his favorite food, snow machine going by, and it'll hit you. But I have a lot of good friends with the church and with our mission organization that I can call on and say, I need you to talk to me, and I need a different voice in my head besides mine. And they'll start telling me about what they're making for dinner or what the dog's doing in the backyard or something that just gets my mind off of it.
Something daily.
Completely different, yeah. Yeah. And do I care that she's making lasagna for dinner? No. But I needed a different voice in my head. And the interesting thing is that the morning he died, it wasn't an emergency. There wasn't any reason for there to be an emergency. But I knew I couldn't just stand there. Like, something needed to happen. So we have dear friends that came with us to Alaska, or they got to Alaska about a month and a half before we did. And they lost their son. He rejected a kidney transplant. He was about 8 years old when he died. And the day he died was August 4th, 2018. And so I knew that they would know what needed to happen. I also knew that they were going to be up because one of them was scheduled to have surgery that morning. So I'm like, I know they're going to be awake. I don't really want to interrupt their surgery because this isn't an emergency. I just need to know what I need to do next. So I called them and I said, hey, Tim passed away last night. And they said, we're on our way. I'm like, no, I just need to know what to do. And they're like, and I don't want to interrupt your surgery. They're like, oh, we just canceled it. We're on our way. And so they showed up and they said, Tim died within like an hour of when their son died. 5 years apart. I'm like, that's just bizarre. But they stuck right there with me. And she's often the one I'll text where I would go, my brain's not in a good spot right now. And so she'll start telling me that she's taking the kids to the dentist or something.
Just something about someone who gets you. Like,
I don't have to explain going, my brain's going all these different directions. And she'll call me at the most random times going, what's going on today? And I could be just fine. I'm like, oh, I'm splitting firewood and I'm walking the dog. Or I could be sitting on the couch going, my brain won't shut off. And she'll say, oh, okay, well, let's talk through. And she'll start telling me what color her shirt is or something, just to get my brain thinking something else. So it's just huge. Or she'll pray with me. She prays with me all the time. So it's to have a friend like that, or just a couple of different friends, sometimes in different time zones, is nice. Yes. To be able to dump on. They understand. They don't have to understand everything, but someone who's got broad shoulders or cares enough about you, doesn't have to be family. In fact, it's almost better if it's not. They can kind of be removed a little bit from the situation.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So tell me about what your thoughts are about moving in the future. You're now a single woman. You've recently lost your husband. You're here in McGrath. I mean, tell me about your thoughts on the future.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that I said I don't really know what I'm supposed to be doing. It was always a we. We are doing this and we're doing that. Now it's me. I'm doing this and I'm doing that, or not. I definitely feel a sense of belonging here in McGrath. I'm still plugged into the church in a lot of different levels. I don't know what Brad mentioned about in the Lodge podcast, but I don't even know what my official title is, but it's an administrator of some kind with
I think
One
he called
Wilderness.
you the SAR.
He called me the transportation czar, and I don't know that I like that name, but I kind of roll my eyes and look at it and go, okay. But yeah, it's administrator with One Wilderness Ministries, and specifically what I'm looking into is being able to expand what we're able to do with our gatherings, and what that looks like for the interior of Alaska. We have a heart for being able to edify and expand and encourage the church in Bush, Alaska, and what that looks like in each village is going to be probably a little bit different. We have an established church here in McGrath, but a lot of villages don't even have that. They might have one or two families who get together occasionally and encourage each other through the word, but to have a church gathering that it talks about in the New Testament, unless you've experienced the desert side of it, where you haven't had that ability to meet together with other believers, you don't really understand the sweetness that entails when you can get together with other families, pray with them, cry with them, and encourage them, say, keep on keeping on, and feed that flame of the gospel. So we want to be able to do that, whether it's bringing folks here or going to that village. The last 3-4 years, we've been able to bring campers from other villages here.
Wow.
And a lot of those campers have a lot of baggage, a lot of stories that break my heart every time I even just see their face. And I know that there's a God-sized hole in that family. And while the camper comes and is fed and is encouraged and has professed faith, they have to go back to that family almost feeling like they're alone. And we don't want them to feel like they're alone. We want to be able to continue that encouragement. And while you can do that with wonderful things like cell phones and technology, nothing beats face-to-face contact and being able to give them a hug, being able to meet their family and encourage their family. So we want to be able to take what we're doing here to those different locations. And what that looks like right now, I don't know. But there's a lot of potential, and it's exciting. So I have an airplane.
What kind of plane is it?
Well, actually, I have a Cessna 150. That's the one I own. The organization that I work with has a Cherokee 6. And then we have a couple other church members that have their own aircraft.
Okay.
And they've all talked about how they would love to be able to use that gift that God's given them with the aircraft. What that looks like, we don't know. But we got to start somewhere. And recruiting pilots, recruiting families, and just keeping that interest alive, recruiting funds as to be able to fill the airplane with fuel or pay insurance and stuff like that. Just the nitty gritty side of things.
I appreciate that, the attitude you have. Here's you obviously have this massive heart for this village and the surrounding villages, a lot of the young people, and then it's like, this is what I want to do, and how do I do that? I don't know. I actually appreciate that.
I don't have an answer.
And it's I think that's good for the life out here. And when you don't know, to say I don't know. Too many people have too many answers, and just say I don't know and ask the Lord, what do you want me to do? There's something beautiful about that, and also just the brokenness that is part of your story now with the loss of your husband. It's now baggage, so to speak. You have more to offer now because of that brokenness in your life, and there's something beautiful about that.
It's exciting to see that. I mean, that doesn't mean my life has ended. That chapter did. But I turned the page.
Turn the page. Well, I'm really excited to see what's on the next few pages for you.
Yeah.
I'm talking to Brad quite a bit. I'm hoping to be flying back to McGrath. Certainly, when I'm busy flying in the summer, I pop in here sometimes. And now I know you a little bit better. So, hey, thank you so much for taking this time. And that was a very vulnerable story. Thank you for being willing to share it on a very public platform like this. And I hope a few people can listen and relate and be encouraged.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Hayley.